Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Martin Dammann. I'm the Customer Success Manager at Truck Science. Today, I'll take you through the process of modifying vehicles to optimize bridge carrying capacity. This webinar will cover the advantages and disadvantages of adding lift axles and changing the wheelbase of the vehicle. I will be using our axle weight calculator to do these demonstrations and at the same time do it using actual examples. So the modifications will be validated against the US federal bridge laws, but we'll also run some comparisons against grandfathered provisions that exist in some of the states. And I'll show you some of the unique requirements that apply to the Canadian provinces. We value our partnership with NTEA and therefore welcome all the NTA members who are joining us today. My colleague Jens Hellberg will help me with answering your questions. Thank you, Jens. Before we do any vehicle modifications, I'll give you a quick overview of the US federal bridge laws. These laws specify the maximum weight that can be carried on the interstate highway system. Now, bar a few exceptions, the bridge formula is used to determine the maximum weight that can be carried on any group of 2 or more consecutive axles. So in this example, where we have the outer bridge distance at 21 feet, and there are 4 axles in the group. If we take these values and we substitute them into the bridge formula, we get a maximum weight of 56,000 pounds. Therefore, to increase the carrying capacity, we can simply add more axles and increase the wheelbase. But it's not quite that simple because we need to confirm these changes with the vehicle manufacturer to ensure that the vehicle has sufficient gross vehicle weight rating for that extra weight. We also need to consider the effect these changes will have on the turning circle and vehicle stability. Here are 2 exceptions to the bridge formula. Single axles are limited to 20,000 pounds and tandems to 34,000. Instead of using the bridge formula, we can also use the bridge table to determine the maximum weights. So the bridge table combines the bridge formula and the exceptions into a simple lookup matrix. So if we take our previous example of 4 axles spread over 21 feet, we get the same maximum weight of 56,000 pounds without having to do the calculations. So our software will do all this for you, but it is good to understand where the values come from. So for our live demo today, we'll start with a 6x4 chassis and a 16-foot dump body to set up our baseline vehicle. Then we'll add a pusher axle and compare our new carrying capacity to our baseline vehicle. Next, we'll extend the wheelbase by 3 feet to see how that affects overall bridge carrying capacity and the turning radius. And finally, we'll add a second pusher and a longer body to optimize our quad axle dump truck. I'll switch to the live demo now. Okay, so in the previous webinars of this series, we explained the process of sourcing and adding the information to do a weight distribution calculation. Today, I'll take advantage of the vehicles, bodies, and equipment that are already in our library, and I'll focus more on the vehicle modifications. So for our dump truck example, we'll use a Volvo VHD 6x4, and we'll choose the model with the set forward axle and the 224-inch wheelbase. This vehicle is already pre-populated with all the required dimensions and weights to do the calculation. But we recommend that you always check our vehicles against the proposal document that you have from your local chassis supplier, and then adjust the values on our vehicles to match those of your on your proposal document. To give you an example of how to do this, we'll start with the dimensions. So you can change the wheelbase here. You can, for example, increase the wheelbase or decrease it again. You can also change the axle spacing and the afterframe. And then for the weights, you'll notice that this chassis weighs slightly more than 16,000 pounds, and that weight is already distributed over the front and rear axles. So if you need to make a change to the weights, you can simply click on the chassis weight for the front axle. That'll open up the menu to the front axle where you can override the chassis weight. Let's say you need to make a change here, or you can deselect the override to return to the original default value. You can also change the gross axle weight rating here. In this case, 14,600, and then the bridge limit is 20,000. We then work the permissible as the lesser of manufacturer rating and the bridge limit. You can make the same changes to the rear axle, and then also under total, you can update, for example, the gross vehicle weight rating. So the manufacturer has given us a rating of 67,600 for this vehicle when adding lift axles. So we can update that. All right, so once the chassis is all set up, we're ready to add our body and hoist. I'll start off with the body and select the dump body from the menu. Here we can either use a template to build a body from scratch, or we can pick one from the public or distributor library. So if you are a bodybuilder and have distributors and upfitters for your bodies, then you have the option of setting up your own unique distributor library. And this allows you to specify who can have access to your products. For our example today, I've already used the DXF import feature to add 2 Crysteel bodies to my personal library. So I'll start off with a 16-foot dump body. You'll notice that as soon as you add a body to a chassis, the software will calculate the maximum payload. And it does it in such a way that neither the axles or the total are overloaded. So in this case, we have slightly more than 23,000 pounds of payload, and the front axle is the limiting factor. Okay, so at this point, we might want to have a look at the utilization here. You'll see got 100% on the front, 92 on the rear, and 90 in total. I want to give you an example of changing this payload manually now. So if I had to override that payload to, let's say, 25,000 pounds, you'll notice that that will immediately overload the front axle, in this case by 300 pounds or 2%. It'll also highlight the overload on the dashboard. So we are not compliant with manufacturer ratings. And it'll put a red cross there. Let's say we move that body back slightly now because we have carrying capacity or surplus carrying capacity on the rear axle. So I'll move that body back. If I move it too far, you'll notice that we overload the rear axle. And in this case, the red cross will appear next to regulatory compliance. If I drill down on that, you'll see we're validating against the US federal bridge laws. We can go further to see that we are not compliant with the bridge laws. So you can read up more information under notes and warnings on the right, where you can see that you are overloaded on the bridge laws. Okay, so let's move that body back to a more practical position of, let's say, 4 inches from the back of the cab. Okay, at that point, neither the front nor rear axles will be overloaded. So we could deselect the override on the payload and allow the software to calculate the maximum payload again. In this case, almost 26,000 pounds, and there's no overload. The rear axle is a limiting factor, but this will not be the final payload for this vehicle because we still need to add the hoist. So let's go to the equipment menu for that and other equipment. And I'll choose a hoist that I've already added to my personal library and move that into position. Right, that hoist weighs about 1,000 pounds, so it adds quite a bit of weight to the front axle, and our front axle now becomes a limiting factor again. Overall, we're utilizing the axles in total permissible to more than 90%, and that would be a good utilization. However, what this does not show is the utilization in terms of the gross vehicle weight rating. So I've already added a favorite measurement for that on the dashboard. where you can see that we are currently only utilizing 69% of the gross vehicle weight rating. So these are new favorite measurements that we added in a recent update. And I'll show you where you can access those under settings. And you can go to favorite measurements. You can scroll down the list until you get to, let's say, the utilization ones. So we've added more here for the utilization of a combination or the vehicle. We've also added favorite measurements for trailers and for the payload. But there are quite a few that you can look at, and you can select up to 5 favorite measurements to display on the dashboard at any time. You can even set up minimum and maximum values under the organization standards for your favorite measurements. Okay, so we'll keep an eye on that figure of 69% to see if we can utilize that, the manufacturer's rating more. So the first step will be to add a lift axle so that we can carry more weight, since we are more or less maxed out at the moment. So in cases where the front axle is the limiting factor, we recommend that you add a pusher axle, because that'll actually take some of the weight off the front axle. In cases where the rear axles are the limiting factor, you could add either a pusher or a tag axle. To add a pusher axle, I'll go to Vehicle, Weights and Axles, Add, and I'll select a pusher. I'll just keep an eye on the payload figure here. So our baseline payload for the 6x4 vehicle is 23,000 pounds. So we'll keep that in mind as we make modifications to the vehicle. So I'll add that pusher now. You'll see the payload increases to 29,000 pounds. So that's 6,000 pounds more for adding that axle. You'll notice that our triaxle group at the rear is now the limiting factor and utilized to 100%. I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's have a quick look at the default values that we use for the pusher axle. So the default axle spacing here is 48 inches. You can change that. And if you need to make any changes to the pusher axle itself, you can click on that axle to open that axle on the vehicle menu. Here you can change the weight of that axle. That'll be the weight of the axle, suspension, and tires combined. We've used a default of 13,000 pounds for the gross axle weight rating. Again, you can change that. And then the bridge limit is 11,600. Now, you may be wondering why that is less than the gross axle weight rating, and that has to do with the tire restriction. So there's a restriction on the tire width, where some states apply 500 pounds per inch of tire width, and therefore we use that as the lowest value in the federal regulations. To adjust that, you could select a wider tire. So to get to at least 13,000 pounds on the bridge here for the axle, we would need to increase the width of the tire to at least 13 inches. So let me do that now, and then go back to weights, and you'll see the bridge limit now adjusts to 13,000 pounds. Okay, next we get to probably the most important attribute for the pusher axle, and that's the percentage of weight carried. So you want to be in control of how much weight the pusher imposes on the road. And in this case, we have just over 10,000 pounds on that pusher. We've recently added a feature to make it easier for you to adjust this weight, so that you can just specify the percentage of weight carried. And that percentage is in relation to the weight carried on all the rear axles. So currently, this axle is carrying about 25% of the weight over all the rear axles. If you need more information about that, you can click on that information icon where you can read up about the explanation for this particular input. So let's increase that value now. So I'll override that. Well, you can maybe keep an eye on the numbers here. So I'll increase the percentage on the pusher axle. That'll increase the weight on the pusher axle itself, but at the same time, it'll decrease the weight on the driven axles and also on the front axle. So I'll keep increasing that, and you can see those values changing. until we hit a limit of 13,000 for that pusher axle. All right, so if you don't need to max out the pusher axle, you could reduce that again. So let's go back to our original value of 24.5%. So hopefully this feature makes it easier for you to get to the actual weight that you want on the pusher axle, and it would be good to get your feedback on this feature. Jens?
Yeah, Martin, we just have a question there about the pusher, whether it's a 10K or a 13K pusher that you've added there.
This is a 13K pusher.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so the manufacturer rating is 13,000. But you can obviously override that. So you could make that 10,000 or even 20,000. It's totally up to you. Okay. All right. Okay, so now that we've had a look at the pusher, let's have a look at the limiting factor on the triaxle group. So you might be wondering where that 42,000 pounds comes from. So to get more information about that, you can go to the bridge view. And here we show the most important bridge groups. You'll see that we show the distance for the triaxle group. In this case, it's 102 inches. So at 102 inches for this group, the bridge laws limit that group to 42,000 pounds. Okay, if we need to go back to the weights table, we can go to Overview on the menu on the right and Summary. Okay, so now let's have a look at our utilization overall. You'll notice that the utilization as a percentage of gross vehicle weight rating has now increased from 69% to 81%. So we are getting better use out of the vehicle, but there is still potential to carry more weight on this vehicle. And to do that, we would need to add, let's say, another pusher axle. Now, it may look like there is sufficient space to fit another axle here, but this space may be used by, for example, the fuel tank, batteries, or exhaust system. So to demonstrate that graphically, I will add a fuel tank here, and I'll choose that from other equipment and search for fuel tank. And I'll add a 75-gallon tank and just move that, let's say, behind the steps here. Okay, so that'll make it more obvious to us that we don't have sufficient space to add another axle, and that we would therefore need to first increase the wheelbase before we can add another axle. Now, there are two ways in which you can change the wheelbase. You can either change it here, or you could swap the vehicle for a vehicle that already has a longer wheelbase. So we recently moved the swap vehicle feature to the toolbar at the top here. And that's just to make it more prominent, and because some people were not aware of this feature. So you can swap out a vehicle here to any other chassis and keep the body and the equipment in place on that vehicle. So without having to do a new calculation. However, when it comes to Class 8 vehicles, you'll find that the manufacturers offer many different wheelbase options, and we may not have the specific wheelbase in our library. So for that purpose, I will manually change the wheelbase by clicking on the wheelbase dimension, and then at the same time, we'll monitor the effect that this will have on the turning radius. So on the menu on the right, I will choose the smallest turning radius. And then as we increase that wheelbase, keep an eye on the turning radius and also on the overall bridge carrying capacity. So we're starting off at a turning radius of 402 inches. That's about 34 feet. And I'll increase the wheelbase by about 3 feet. So as I increase the wheelbase, you'll notice how the turning radius increases. You'll also notice how the overall bridge carrying capacity increases. And I'll push that all the way up to 260 inches. So our turning radius has increased by 52 inches, or roughly 4 feet. And our overall bridge carrying capacity has increased by 2,000 pounds to 58,000 pounds. Okay. Another new feature we added recently is to allow you to specify whether the pusher axle is steering or not. Let me demonstrate that. I'll go back to the weights and axles tab for the pusher. and let's deselect the steering axle. So we'll make that non-steering. So you'll notice that the turning radius becomes slightly smaller, in fact, but there will be a considerable amount of tire scrub on that axle, and also more stress on that axle. So we'll set that back to a steering axle, and in some cases it is mandatory for the pusher axle to be steering. And I'll give you an example of that for the Ontario in Canada later on. So let's set that back to steering again. Okay, so if you're comfortable with that increase in the turning radius, we can go back to the side view. Remember, when you've made a modification to the chassis, it will affect the front and rear chassis weights slightly for the extra chassis length. So I'll go to the front axle and just increase that by, let's say, 100 pounds. And I'll do the same on the rear axle. I'll just increase that by 100 pounds as well. Okay, this body is not ideally suited for such a long chassis, so I'll remove that and replace it with a longer body. So I'll go back to bodies and add a 19.5-foot body. Let's leave a clearance of about 8 inches for that and move the hoist back into position. All right, so our vehicle is now set up correctly for that second pusher axle. So I'll go back to the vehicle menu, weights and axles, add that pusher. Okay, the second pusher will assume the same default values as the first pusher. So it'll also be a 13,000 pound axle, and the axle spacing will be 48 inches. You'll notice that the payload has now increased to 36,000 pounds. And that's because our overall bridge has increased by another 5,000 pounds from 58,000 to 63,000 when we added that second pusher. So you can see from this, if you compare this to our baseline vehicle, which had a payload of only 23,000 pounds, we've managed to increase that by 13,000 pounds to get all the way up to about 36,000 pounds. So it is really effective to add lift axles and to extend the wheelbase of a vehicle. Okay, so let me just check with Jens there, if there are any questions. Sorry, I can't hear you, Jens.
Sorry, there's just one question about the steerable pushers, just more of a confirmation, I suppose, that steerable pushers decrease the curb-to-curb turning circle.
Okay, I'll get that. Okay, I'll get back to that. We can maybe have a look at that. Steerable pushers do not decrease it. I'll just go to the smallest turning radius here. If it is non-steering, it'll actually decrease the turning radius, because when the pusher axles are steered, they are excluded from the wheelbase for turning. So you'll see that the wheelbase, in this case, because they are steering, goes all the way to the center of the driven axles. So that creates a very long wheelbase and a very big turning circle. If these axles are not steering, then they actually reduce the turning radius. And it's a tire scrub that actually brings that wheelbase down. But obviously that's not very good for the infrastructure, but non-steered pusher axles will actually reduce the curb-to-curb turning radius. Okay, maybe we can also take that offline and clarify that more if it needs be.
Sorry, Martin, there's another question. How do you determine the percentage of weight on the pusher axles?
Okay, so the default percentage on the pusher axles, so I'll click on this pusher axle here. So the default percentage in this case is only 20%. So by default, we use the gross axle weight rating for this particular pusher in relation to the gross axle weight ratings of all the axles at the rear. That gives us a default of 20%. But as I mentioned early on, you can now change that to carry more weight on that pusher if you want to. And in practice, you would simply increase or decrease the air pressure in the suspension to achieve that. So if I increase the percentage on this first pusher, you'll see how it increases the weight on that pusher. And you would just increase the pressure and the air pressure for that suspension to achieve that. Okay, so we go back to the default of 19.7%. Okay. Then I might just point out the utilization again. Now that we've added our second pusher, you'll see that the utilization of the gross vehicle weight rating is now 93%. So anything over 90% is pretty good. And we won't be able to increase this by much more or add another axle. So this is as far as we'll go in terms of modifying the chassis and adding lift axles. But I still want to show you some of the comparisons for this vehicle in the different states where we can apply some of the grandfathered provisions. So remember, this is what the vehicle will carry under the federal regulations. Let's see if this vehicle operates in Idaho, what would change. So I'll go to settings and I'll remove the federal regulations and add the regulations for Idaho. And we'll use the state road regulations. Now, Idaho has its own bridge formula, and you'll see the overall bridge carrying capacity now increases by about 4,000 pounds to 67,600. And the payload increases to just over 40,000 pounds. You'll also notice that Idaho allows slightly higher weights on the tandem, for example, 37,800 instead of the usual 34,000 under the federal laws. And Idaho applies 600 pounds per inch for tire width. So we wouldn't need to overspec the tires in Idaho. In fact, we could make them narrower again. We could go back to our default of, let's say, 11.6 inches for tire width. That would be in metric a 295 tire. And you'll notice that if I go back to weights now, the bridge limit is still almost 14,000 pounds because of the 600 pounds per inch that is applied. So we don't really need to overspec the tires for Idaho. But there are other states, for example, Minnesota, which I'll show you in a minute, where that limit of 500 pounds applies. Okay, so let's say this vehicle had to operate on both state and interstate roads in Idaho. What we can do is we can validate against multiple regulations. So let's say we load this vehicle on state roads, and we lock down that payload so that the software doesn't recalculate the payload automatically. And then I'll go back to settings and add the Idaho interstate regulations. Okay, so now on the interstate, the limit goes back to 63,000 pounds, and this vehicle would be overloaded if it was loaded to 40,000 pounds. So that'd be an overload of about 4,500 pounds. You'll notice on the dashboard, we have a red cross again for regulatory compliance. If I drill down on that, you'll see that we are legal on Idaho state roads, but not legal on the interstate. So to be legal everywhere, you'd need to let the software calculate the maximum payload again by deselecting that override. So that takes us back down to 36,000 pounds for the payload. Okay, so that's one example of a vehicle operating in the same state on state roads and interstate roads. Let's say a vehicle operates between two different states, but only on state roads. So for that example, we'll use Minnesota and Iowa. So I'll remove the regulations for Idaho and add in Minnesota state roads, and we'll apply that. Now, Minnesota uses the federal bridge laws, so you'll recognize these limits here. 63,000 pounds overall, payload is back to 36,000 pounds. You'll also notice that on the pusher, the limit is now 11,600, the one where we reduced the tire width, because Minnesota applies the limit of 500 pounds per inch. Since we're not fully utilizing the pusher axle anyway, we could probably reduce the tire size on the first pusher we added as well. So you could make that 11.6 There's no need to overspec the tires in the state either. Okay, so now if we look at our utilization, we're still at 100%, 93% of gross vehicle weight rating. Let's say this vehicle now goes across to Iowa on state roads. So Iowa has uses its own bridge formula again and applies lower limits than the federal bridge laws. So what I'll do is I'll lock down this payload again and then go to settings and add Iowa. Okay, and only state roads. So you'll notice that the total gross carrying capacity reduces by about 3,500 pounds. And we are overloaded again. And again, we can see that we would be legal in Minnesota, but not in Iowa. So to be legal in both states, we need to allow the software to calculate the maximum payload again, which now reduces to 32,000 pounds, which is quite a big difference if you compare this to the state regulations for Idaho. So there's a difference of 8,000 pounds in payload carrying capacity. So it is very important to check where the vehicle will be operating. Okay, so for our last example, we'll use the Ontario regulations in Canada. So I'll go back to settings and remove the regulations for these two states. And you'll see that we've now added regulations for Ontario, Quebec, and Quebec Thor. And we will be adding more Canadian provinces in the near future. So for this example, we'll use the Ontario SPIF regulations, and we'll change the measurement system to metric, since these regulations specify the limits in kilograms and millimeters. Okay, so now Canada has some unique requirements and typically has vehicle types. So they use designated vehicle and combination types. And for this example, you'll immediately see that there's a warning or a tip in the bottom left corner. So we've specifically added these tips to guide you towards a compliant, valid vehicle for a specific truck type in Ontario. So right now, this tip is telling us that for a 6x4 chassis, we can only have one pusher axle. So you'll see that we can't validate this vehicle with two pusher axles. So we'll have to remove one. So I'll remove this, the second one we added. The next tip will ask us if we want to validate this as a truck type 3 or truck type 5. Let's say we want to go for truck type 5, which would give us higher weights. Then we would need to change the gross axle weight rating on the pusher to between 6,000 and 9,500 kilograms. So let's make that 9,000 kilograms for the gross axle weight rating. The regulation limit is now less because of the tire restriction in Ontario. So let's put on a bigger tire. Let's make that a 385 tire to give us a little bit more carrying capacity on that axle in terms of the tire restriction. Okay, so we've resolved that issue, but we're still not compliant on the regulation. So we can drill down on that again for Ontario to see that we're not complying with weights and dimensions. Remember, for more information, we can go to Notes and Warnings and read up about that. So in this case, the lift axle needs to be at least 2,500 millimeters, 2,510 millimeters from the driven axle. And the lift axle cannot be deployed if it is carrying less than 4,000 kilograms. So let's change the axle spacing here to 2,510. And you'll also notice that that dimension is highlighted in red to indicate that it is not compliant at the moment. So I'll change that to 2,510. Okay, that will resolve both those issues. So the axle now carries more than 4,000 pounds. Next up, we can have a look at the restriction on the driven axles. You'll notice that they are currently limited to 15,000 kilograms. So Ontario has this unique allowance where the driven axles can carry 18,000 kilograms, provided the weight is equalized over all 3 axles at the rear. Now, to achieve this, the equalization, we would go to the pusher axle and specify that this axle carries 33.3% of the weight over all these rear axles. That would equalize the weight, so each axle would carry 7,400 pounds in this case. And you'll notice that that limit has now increased from 15,000 to 18,000 kilograms. We still have an overload, or in fact an underload situation on the front axle now. So there's a requirement for this vehicle to have at least 23% of the gross vehicle weight on that front axle. At the moment, we only have 19.8%. So to shift more weight to the front axle, we can assume that we can load this vehicle heavy up front, and I'll move the center of gravity of the payload forward slightly until we achieve 23%. So you'll see here we are 21.6. As I change that, we put more weight onto the front axle until we comply with a minimum of 23%. At that point, the vehicle is legal and we have a payload of about 17 tons on there. Okay, there's one more feature I'll show you now with the steering axle on this pusher. So I'll go back to the smallest turning radius for that. Again, you'll see by default that's a steering axle. Let's say we make that non-steering. And you'll see again the wheelbase for turning, which affects the turning radius curb to curb, is all the way to the center of the driven axles. That's again because the steering pusher is excluded from that calculation. If we had to make that a non-steering axle, you'll see that the turning radius does get smaller and the wheelbase for turning is reduced. But because of the scrub between the tires and the road here, this would not really be practical, and that would definitely not be infrastructure friendly. And Ontario is all about safe, productive, infrastructure-friendly vehicles. Hence, this needs to be a steering axle. So we'll set that back to steering, which again increases our turning radius, but is more friendly towards the infrastructure. Okay, that's as far as we'll go for the live demo today. Jens, are there any more questions before we go back to the slides?
There is a question here. How accurate are the base chassis weights? And the question is, a follow-up question then, do you get those from the chassis OEM? And I was just explaining that it depends on the OEM. Some provide accurate chassis weights for the base specs, while others prefer that you get the information from the dealer. So as Martin was saying at the beginning, we would definitely recommend that you check the weights and make sure they comply with your proposal document.
Yeah, so the chassis weights will obviously differ based on the choice of axles, the choice of wheelbase, the choice of driveline. So it'll vary slightly from whatever we have in our library. The values that we use would have been for a very particular build and a proposal document that we received from either the manufacturer or the dealer. In this case, this chassis, we got the chassis weights from the manufacturer themselves. Okay, so we got that from Volvo. All right, so I'll go back to the slides now.
There was Martin. There was also another question about pricing and whether the software can be purchased through NTA. And I pointed out there that the purchase would be directly with Truck Science at our website truckscience.com. And I see there's another question that's come through here. Is it possible to override the default chassis weights?
Yes. Okay. I'll go back to the default chassis weights. So you can click on the chassis weight here in the weights table, or you can even click on the front axle and then simply, I've already done it. overrode that to cater for the extra chassis length, but you can type in your own value here. You may want to make that 4,300 pounds and apply that change. So it's totally flexible. You can change chassis weights, axle ratings, wheelbase, and several other values. Okay, is that it, Jens?
Yeah, that's it so far. Are there any other questions? Feel free to reach out.
Okay.
If we don't get around to answering your questions during the webinar, please just get in touch either via our website or send us an email at support@truckscience.com.
All right. I think most of you already have access to our software, but like Jens mentioned, also for those who don't, please visit our website at truckscience.com, where you can register for a free 7-day trial. NTA members qualify for an extended 30-day trial. The professional edition of the software costs $50 per month, and NTEA members get a 10% discount.
Just there's a follow-up question there about if a chassis is not in the library, can it be uploaded by the user? So there are two options there. You can create your own template, but the template would be more of a schematic, so it won't look exactly like the vehicle, but you can specify whatever weights and dimensions you would like. So it's extremely flexible. The other alternative is to send our support team the spec, and they can upload it for you and make it available in the library.
Yeah. Okay, so to come back to that template that Jens mentioned, so you'll see the graphic looks very generic or basic, but you have total flexibility to change all the dimensions, including bumper to back of cab, height, chassis height. So you have a few more options on a vehicle template, or if you prefer to have the actual vehicle added, you have the option here to request a vehicle. So you can request it, provide some details, any documentation you can share with us will make it easier for us to add that vehicle for you. Or you can take something similar or a base vehicle and modify it like we did today. Okay. I'll end this. Is that it, Jens, for the questions?
Yes, there are no more questions.
Okay. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to your feedback. Goodbye, everyone.